firing another ballistic missile amid a U.S. state visit by the leader of Japan.
Yeah, and here's what we know this hour. South Korean officials say North Korea fired an intermediate-range missile. It happened earlier today, and the sources tell us it was launched from a province in the northwestern part of the country. Now, this is a missile that traveled about 300 miles before it crashed into the Sea of Japan.
As that happened, President Donald Trump was hosting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Florida. Last night, the two leaders were briefed on the situation, and then they each made statements. Watch.
North Korea's most recent missile launch is absolutely intolerable. North Korea must fully comply with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions.
I just want everybody to understand and fully know that the United States of America stands behind Japan, its great ally, 100%. Thank you.
All right, our team of correspondents and expert analysts are standing by to break this down. Matt Rivers is live in Seoul, South Korea. Ryan Brown is our Pentagon reporter.
And we want to go to Ryan Brown right now. So, Ryan, talk to us about what you're hearing there at the Pentagon about the response to this.
That's right, Christy. What we're starting to see is, the Pentagon tracked this missile through Strategic Command. They were well aware of the launch, and they've seen these kind of tests before. But what we're seeing now with Secretary Jim Mattis, Donald Trump's pick to run the Pentagon, is a real concerted effort to boost missile defense in the region. We saw earlier this month, along with Japan, the U.S. military conducted a successful test of a missile defense system, shooting down a medium-range missile. And we're seeing Secretary of Defense Mattis on his first trip abroad went to South Korea, where, among other things, he discussed this new THAAD missile defense system, kind of getting that in place before the end of 2017. So there's a real concerted effort to boost defenses in the region. Of course, there are thousands of troops stationed in Guam, in Japan, and South Korea. So kind of even though this missile couldn't reach the continental United States, those troops very much at risk for this kind of system.
We know that the South Korean Director of National Security spoke to President Trump's National Security Advisor, of course, Michael Flynn, and they talked about options. Do we know anything about those options they spoke of?
Well, it's still a little early to say, of course. I think there's still a lot of things being discussed. One of them is to kind of go to Beijing, could go to the UN Security Council potentially to kind of seek a potentially ramped up sanctions against North Korea. This is something that Donald Trump spoke about a lot during the campaign trail, was kind of getting China's buy-in to kind of help restrain North Korea. Of course, that's something that's been the goal of U.S. policy for some time, dating back to the six-party talks era. So we're not really seeing anything concrete yet. Of course, these plans for missile defense systems to be ramped up were in place before this most recent test, but I think this is just going to add a little bit of urgency to that.
All righty. Ryan Brown, we appreciate it so much.
You bet.
All right, let's bring in Christopher Hill. He is a former U.S. ambassador to South Korea and Iraq. Ambassador, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So let's first start with China, which is at the center of Donald Trump's approach to North Korea. He talked a lot about it during the campaign. Just weeks ago, as president-elect, he talked about it on Twitter, that China should get involved here. To what degree do you glean that China is prepared to ramp up their involvement in kind of stomping out this progression from North Korea?
Well, of course, trying to get China more involved has been a long-standing effort by the United States. And frankly, many times we've been disappointed by China's involvement. Now, whether they are concerned about a North Korean collapse and refugees, or whether they're concerned that a North Korean collapse would mean a South Korea takeover and then a U.S. presence on their border, hard to say. But what is clear is that we cannot outsource this to China. I don't think we're going to get anywhere with that. But we do need to work with China. China needs to be part of the solution here. They are right there in the region. They do have close ties with North Korea. They could do more. And I think this really behooves this administration that needs to really get more involved with China. I think it was a good sign the other day that President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump had a good conversation on the telephone. I think that's really essential, especially to try to put to rest this issue of the one China policy. But now I think there's going to have to be some really serious diplomacy and another sort of effort, I think, really to get the Chinese on board.
So in the absence of elevated or increased involvement from China, we've seen that the sanctions from the UN have not really acted as effective deterrents. We know that the Obama administration's strategic patience, as it was called, wasn't really effective. What are, I guess, the options, as we talked about with Ryan, on the table that would most likely, from what we know from President Trump, would be the next steps that he would take?
Well, first of all, I think we need to make sure the Chinese are really fully implementing the UN Security Council sanctions. I mean, they've done a lot more in the last year than they've done in the past, but that is one thing that needs to be done. Secondly, I think China can do more in terms of its bilateral relations with North Korea, in terms of the financial sector, where much of North Korea's finances end up in. So I think they need to do more there. And then probably in the energy sector, I think China can really put some heat, so to speak, on the North Koreans by blocking some fuel shipments. So there are more things that need to be done there, but there needs to be some strategic trust between China and the United States. You know, when you call into question things like the One China policy, which is really a bedrock issue, the Chinese kind of pull away and say, you know, can we really do business with this new administration? So I think it's very important that they somehow reestablish a strategic trust with China and try to work through these issues. At the same time, I think it's very important that we understand that, as your earlier piece suggested, we need to keep up the strong alliance. Certainly, it was a great occasion to have the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe with the president this weekend, but he also needs to reach out to the South Koreans, who, after all, are the ones within long-range artillery of North Korea.
Well, let's go to South Korea now. Our Matt Rivers is tracking developments from Seoul. And it's important to point out the distinction, Matt, that this was not one of those ICBMs, not the intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the U.S. mainland. Tell us more about what indeed was tested and how this is being received there in Seoul.
Sure. Before, this is an intermediate type of rocket this type of missile was tested by the of those 8 tests last year were considered to be failures. They're still trying to figure out whether this particular test that was done this morning here around 7:55 a.m. South Korea time was in fact a failure or a success. But the fact remains that it wasn't one of those ICBMs. And that's interesting because many observers were expecting or thinking that it could have been, given what we've heard from Kim Jong-un. It was on January 1st up in North Korea that Kim